Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar being organised by the Centre for English Identity and Politics called Progressive Patriotism, Lessons from Wales. If you're wondering why the Centre for English Identity and Politics is having a seminar on progressive patriotism in Wales, it's partly because the Centre is interested more generally in the links between national identity and politics. And obviously over the last 20 years, national identity has become significantly more important in Scotland, in Wales, and even in England, where it's often said it doesn't play a role in politics. In 2019, 70% of the people who said they were more English than British voted Conservative, and Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party actually won amongst the people who were more British than English. So these things are live everywhere. And second reason, of course, for raising this is that 20 years ago, there was a Labour majority in each nation on the island of Britain. Now Wales is the only place where Labour is in government. So understanding how or why that has happened is obviously of interest, yes, to the Labour Party and the rest of Britain, but also to other parties, rivals and opponents as well. We've got a great panel to lead the discussion today. Leighton Andrews is a Professor of Practice in Public Service Leadership and Innovation at Cardiff Business School. Leighton was elected to the National Assembly, as it then was, in 2003 for Rhondda, and he served there till 2016 and had periods as a Deputy Minister, Minister for Education and Skills and Minister for Public Services. Mick Antoniv has been the Welsh Labour and Co-op member for the Senedd in Pontypridd since 2011. He served as Counsel General for Wales from 2016 to 17 and took that post up again this year. And he's the author of We the People, The Case for Radical Federalism. And our final speaker will be Laura McAllister, who is currently Professor of Public Policy and Governance of Wales at the Welsh Government Centre at Cardiff University and a very widely respected observer of Welsh politics and constitutional issues. Just before we start, to say there is a chat function that you can use, but there's also a question and answer function. If you'd like to put a question, which I would put on your behalf, please use the Q&A button, because that's the one that I'm going to be monitoring most closely. And you are able there to indicate if you support somebody else's question being a priority. So to get us underway, I'll go first to Leighton Andrews, who I think is going to give us a longer term, it'll be his judgment how long term, but a longer term perspective on the evolution of Welsh Labour. Leighton.
Thank you, John. And I'm going to try and cover in my contribution politics, policy and culture, and I'm going to leave constitutional issues to Mick and to Laura. Let me take you back to 1999 in the first elections for the National Assembly. The Labour Party in Wales went into those elections with no real Welsh policies, with a party that was actually quite divided, because there'd been a bruising leadership battle between Alan Michael and Rhodri Morgan. And Labour underperformed what people had expected it to do in those first Assembly elections. It won 28 seats, 27 constituency seats, 1 list seat, and Plaid Cymru had its best ever result, not excelled since. The next year, Rhodri Morgan takes over as leader of the Labour Assembly Group and as what was then called First Secretary. And during that period of 2000 to 2003, Welsh Labour really develops. It develops policies, it develops branding as Welsh Labour. Rhodri terms the Welsh Executive the Welsh Assembly Government. A coalition is formed with the Liberal Democrats. Rhodri develops an approach to Labour in Wales, Welsh Labour, which in a sense, if you like, is defined not only against other parties, but also to a degree against New Labour in London, typified by a phrase he never actually used in a speech, but was written into the text, clear red water. And part of that Welsh Labour identity, let me say, the Welsh language also started to become more important. 2003 elections, Welsh Labour wins 30 out of the 60 seats in the Assembly, regaining heartland seats previously lost to Plaid Cymru. And it had a range of Wales-based policies, including, for example, free bus travel for pensioners, free prescriptions. In 2007, just before Gordon Brown really takes over from Tony Blair, Welsh Labour has a poor election result, down to 26 seats. Faced with the threat of an all-party rainbow coalition in government, Labour nevertheless carries on in government, and this, I think, demonstrates the importance to Rhodri Morgan and others of maintaining the reins of government. Rhodri understood the importance of power, and that attempt at a rainbow coalition breaks down. Welsh Labour then forms the One Wales coalition with Plaid Cymru. This, if you like, is a historic compromise endorsed by the Welsh Labour Conference. And interestingly, of course, most Welsh Labour MPs were against this coalition. Most Welsh Labour Assembly members were in favour of it. So power clearly shifts within the Labour Party in Wales, within Welsh Labour, from Westminster to Cardiff Bay. Wales, if you like, rejects Labour's traditional Westminsterism. Welsh Labour is also able to renew in government. In 2009, following a leadership contest, Carwyn Jones is elected as leader. And then we have the UK Conlib coalition from May 2010. In that period, there's a referendum on the powers of the Assembly, which endorses the role of the Assembly. Welsh Labour campaigns under the slogan "Standing Up for Wales," very much building that notion of the party and its identification with the Welsh people into its messaging. And in May 2011, Welsh Labour again wins 30 out of the 60 seats. In that period, of course, of the Conlib coalition, we see what became known as the War on Wales. David Cameron taking aim at the Welsh Health Service, Michael Gove taking aim at the Welsh Education Service. And that helped, in a sense, reinforce that sense, that notion of Welsh Labour standing up for Wales against Westminster. I'm going to skip now quickly to 2021, where we've seen Welsh Labour again win 30 out of the 60 seats on the back of, I think, what has been a significant competence boost demonstrated through the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. But that has also raised significantly the consciousness of devolution, both in Wales and the UK, from that period in May 2020, as Welsh Labour under Mark Drakeford took a different approach from the UK government. Mark's profile probably has been the highest of any Labour First Minister since devolution. I'm not going to run through in detail policies that have been specific to Wales, but Welsh Labour has been able to develop policies that have been different, for example, in reaction to austerity, creating the great financial crash, creating the PROACT wage subsidy scheme. It's maintained its policies despite austerity, free bus travel, free prescriptions, free breakfasts in the poorest schools, while students avoided the £9,000 fees in the 2012 to 2016 period, and subsequent to that, there's been a new grant scheme. Employer support grants saved employed workers' jobs. Education maintenance allowance was retained. Trade unions in Wales, public service trade unions, Wales legislated to take them out of the provisions of the 2016 Trade Union Act. New childcare policies introduced, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, the Violence Against Women Act, etc. So Welsh Labour has been able to mount an effective policy programme in opposition to the UK government, reinforcing that sense of standing up for Wales. And Wales had foundational economy policies before we had the concept of the foundational economy. Final thing I want to say is about culture. There are many forms of Welshness, just as there are many forms of Englishness. But Wales is a small country, and that is part of its identity. Welshness reflects that. And you can see that in some of the things that Rhodri Morgan says in his own autobiography. You can see it in some of the things Mark Drakeford has said quite recently, referring to our special country on Saturday, the day that Gareth Bale won his 100 caps. Welshness lends itself, because of that small country status, to narratives of anti-colonialism and indeed to narratives of class resistance. Welshness is very much an oppositional philosophy. It's not clear that Englishness is necessarily, though there is some evidence in the research by Ailsa Henderson and Richard Wynne-Jones to suggest that perhaps it has become a form of resistance. And of course, there has within Englishness been a long historical narrative of throwing off the Norman yoke, but you'd have to go back a few centuries to look into that. But it's been a deeply cultural response. And you see it in the BBC Wales advert for the Six Nations tournament, Stereophonics song, "As long as we beat the English, we're all right." You see it in Gareth Bale's baiting of the English football team in 2016. And of course, in Wales, the red wall means something completely different from England, because the red wall is the official supporters club for the Football Association of Wales. So Welsh Labour has had a clear identification of itself and its politics as Labour standing up for Wales. It's developed distinct policies, and it has significant cultural resonance. And the one thing I will say on the Constitution, of course, is that Welsh Labour has not been afraid to open up questions of the UK state, on which Welsh Labour has taken significantly different positions from both UK Labour and Scottish Labour.
Leighton, thank you very much indeed. That's a brilliant way of getting us underway. And your three points about identification, policy and cultural resonance, I'm sure we'll come back to, and would say to people on the call, if you've got questions, do start putting them into the Q&A function. I made a mistake. You can't actually upvote them. It seems it's only the hosts and the panelists who can see the questions, but do put them in there, and I will draw on those when we get to the discussion. But to follow on from Leighton, can we go straight to Mick, please? Mick.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this. And it's one of a number of debates taking place all around the UK, actually, on this issue of Constitution. I've had people say to me, well, the Constitution isn't important, no one's raised it on the doorstep. Well, I find that difficult to believe, bearing in mind the number of years we've just had on Brexit and the debates we're having now, which are clearly all about Constitution. Perhaps it's the way people actually see it, though, on the way these things impact on their lives. Like Leighton, I was involved in the early referendum on devolution in 1979, the failed referendum, the one that is rarely mentioned these days, but it is worth mentioning because it shows over the 40 years how significantly mood and opinion has shifted within Wales. In 1979, Labour lost hands down the referendum, admittedly on the the tail end of a increasingly unpopular Labour government. But nevertheless, the fact that devolution was rejected overwhelmingly, English-speaking, Welsh-speaking areas across Wales by and large. So those shifts constitutionally have been significant. So in 1999, when the Senedd, when the National Assembly of Wales was established, even from them to the present day, so the last 20 years, the mood and the opinion and the dynamic of politics, I think, has shifted still further. The Assembly, when it was set up, was effectively a form of administrative council. It then moved through legislation, through the 2006 Government of Wales Act, to obtain legislative powers. It then moved still further to become effectively a full parliament, a Senedd, as it is now called, but a parliament with legislative powers. Why is that significant? Well, it's significant, one, because it is very different to how it was when it was established, and certainly very different to what was talked about back in 1979, where Labour, as Leighton rightly identifies, was incredibly divided and in fact predominantly antagonistic towards the concept of devolution. And the reason these things are important, I think, is because there is a dynamic that has changed. And it has changed around identity as well. And it has changed the framework of the whole basis of the UK and Westminster sovereignty. And I think the issue of sovereignty and shared sovereignty is now a fundamental point in terms of understanding the, I suppose, the conflicts, the dysfunctions that exist constitutionally, but also the way in which they can actually be resolved. And I take the view that when you just had the one parliament in Westminster, the one legislature, it was clear where sovereignty lay. But the moment parliaments were established with legislative powers in Wales and Scotland and in Northern Ireland as well, I think that sovereignty changed, because if we truly believe that sovereignty lies with the people, the moment you create an elected parliament with legislative powers, that sovereignty begins to be something that is shared. And part of the constitutional conflict we have now, which also feeds into identity as well, is over really what the role of Westminster is. What is the role of the UK Parliament? And until that is actually resolved, I think dysfunction will continue. Leighton also referred, of course, to the clear red water issue. Now, I think that is actually quite important, because what it shows is the distinction that was developing in terms of the creation of specific Welsh policies, a specific Welsh identity within politics and within the UK political structure. And the fact that I think within Wales that has been done has been something that has, I think, carried people with it, is part of the reason for the success of Welsh Labour over the past couple of decades. I think the idea from those who are critical of that, who support perhaps the more centralised pan-UK Labour politics, I think the answer is that the moment that devolution was established, the moment that it moved towards becoming parliaments rather than assemblies, Wales was never going to continue politically as an appendage to a sort of broader UK centralised politics. Anyone who thought that, I think, was always a misunderstanding of the way in which devolution and the decentralisation of power works. And I think the other factor that's occurring across the UK now, which is significant, and I think with Welsh Labour has managed to consolidate, is the politics of identity, of community politics. And I think there are two big factors. One is globalisation, in which people want to be seen to have more control over their affairs, or feel that they have the decisions taken which they have no control over. And that, of course, exacerbated by deindustrialisation, which has broken down what were a number of very significant pan-UK structures, whether it be mining, whether it be steel, whether it be heavy industry, and so on. And the loss of those, I think, has been significant. So where are we now? Well, we had the Senate elections, as has already been mentioned, earlier this year. Labour had certainly a result that was boosted by, I suppose, the competence point that has been made in respect of COVID. But I think there is something clear. I think there was a very distinct and a very clear position that was taken by Welsh Labour based on Welsh values, based on Welsh policies, Welsh competence, the benefit, I suppose, of being in government for a number of years, putting all those together. And what it able to show was that there has been divergence, that there is constitutional issues that are important to democracy and the delivery of public services, and then a policy agenda which also includes things that are not only very Welsh, but very socialist and traditionalist within the Labour tradition, which I think is very much tuned and accorded with Welsh people and Welsh thinking. You know, if you look at the issue of the fact that the airport being taken into public ownership, the railways now being in public ownership, the support for cooperative and mutual initiatives, the fact that there is a social partnership bill underway to consolidate and create for the first time in the UK a statutory body that pulls together government, business and trade unions within a framework that has socio-economic objectives. I think those things are very, very significant, and I think they feed in, and they've managed to establish, I think, an idea that there's nothing wrong with difference, there's nothing wrong with divergence. I do not take that there is any sort of great growth of antagonism to other nations, the UK. In fact, the feeling I get is really that the ability to work as a coalition within Wales, and all governments in Wales have one way or another been a coalition since devolution, has been one that has enabled, I think, not only the creation of an identity, but the creation of a set of policies, and I think a certain degree of pride in putting Wales first and putting the people of Wales first in an environment where people feel increasingly non-represented or disempowered. And I think those are the key factors, I think, that have led, I think, to those election results in May, but also to the fact the consolidation now of Welsh Labour as an entity in itself within the Labour Party. And I don't think that should be underestimated. And that accords very much with what I think we begin to see in the regions of England, whether it be Manchester, Liverpool, the success Labour's had within mayoral elections, where community identity has been much more significant. And the Constitutional Commission that is being set up is one which is about actually looking at how we enhance democracy within Wales, how we look at the options for what our future relationship might be. But as the First Minister has said, the irresponsibility of not being aware of events that are taking place in the rest of the UK, whether that be in England or whether it be in Scotland or indeed in Northern Ireland. Now, thanks.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Mick, and that complements what Leighton had to say perfectly. Can I say to the audience at the moment, the chat function, the Q&A function's now been changed, so you can actually see the questions that have been posed, upvote ones you like and add your own, so please do use that. We're already getting some questions coming in. So to have a reflection or a response on both those contributions from an academic point of view, can I turn now to Laura? Laura, please.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, John. Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, I think I'm here just to give you a sort of academic context to some of the remarks that my good colleagues Leighton and Mick have raised. By the way, I agree with a lot of what's been said, but I'll push back at a little bit of it. I mean, I appreciate this isn't a seminar on Labour's electoral success, although it is relevant, of course, because, you know, next year will mark the centenary of Labour's domination of Welsh politics, you know, 100 years of winning every national election. And that's quite some achievement, you know, and I'm sure there'll be great parties in Welsh Labour around that. But I do think harsher and more difficult challenges lie ahead for Welsh Labour than the ones they faced certainly in May this year. And there's a couple of reasons why I think Labour did so well in the May elections. Mark Drakeford is a big factor in that. Leighton mentioned his visibility, his awareness, and indeed his popularity. You know, I think if you contrast that with previous First Ministers, I think Carwyn Jones was still not known by a large chunk of the population, despite being in power for a decade, whereas Mark Drakeford was actually better known than Keir Starmer in some of our polling before the Senedd elections. And those that did know him, by and large, gave pretty high approval ratings. And of course, COVID had a significant role in elevating Mark's profile, but it was more about what Welsh Labour did to capture the success that they gained at the ballot box in May. And if I can just start with something that we do know from the Welsh Election Survey, which I think is really critical to all of this, is that Labour, probably always, but more so than ever, has done very well amongst people who feel more Welsh than British, but it's gained support from across the spectrum, unlike the other two parties. So whereas Labour has gained support mainly from people, or predominantly from people who feel Welsh, and I think that was played extremely well, by the way, tactically in the Senedd elections, it also didn't hemorrhage support from those voters who feel predominantly British or fit somewhere in between that spectrum. And I think we all know that's a very hard and delicate balancing act for a political party to manage during an election context. Its opponents, and again, you know, different to Scotland, I'll come on to that in a moment, different to Scotland, Labour was facing two very different opponents in terms of the Welsh Conservatives and Plaid Cymru. And both of those parties, if you look at where they gained their greatest degrees of support, were not surprisingly, in the Conservatives' case, from those who felt more British, but then a steep decline for the Conservatives amongst those who felt more Welsh. The other way round, you know, turn that on its head for Plaid Cymru, and you can see why there's a ceiling for the support that both of those parties could get. I think that's a really important precursor to any conversation about where Labour's identity fits with voters at the moment. The other point I'd make, really, and I think both Mick and Leighton alluded to this, is that for Welsh Labour in this election, it was a case of bringing people back into voting Labour rather than breaking new ground. And I think that's really, really important in terms of profile and success of that. I mean, hesitate to use the language of kind of coming back home because, you know, it sounds terribly patronising. And I think that's probably a mistake in terms of voters' minds. But what Welsh Labour didn't have to do was entice back with new offers. This was about elevating what I think Mick referred to as typical Welsh values, or typical values that are important to the vast majority of Welsh people, therefore presenting them as Labour values, therefore attracting them back into the Labour fold. And that whole kind of slogan of if you value it, vote for it, really appealed, I think, to the psyche of Wales in May after 18 months of obviously a global pandemic. That takes me on to the juxtapositioning of Labour and its identity with Plaid Cymru. Really important, because I think the mistake a lot of people make when they look at this whole question of patriotism, identity in politics, is they immediately compare Wales with Scotland. And that can be a useful comparison, but it's not the only one. You know, we've got to look at comparisons between Wales and England as well. Really different, I think, in terms of relationships with Plaid Cymru. I think the best way of putting it is that Labour has effectively neutered Plaid. You can put this in a whole host of ways, whether it's kind of Labour moving its tank onto Plaid Cymru lawns or, being a soft nationalist party. I mean, actually, I think, if anything, Welsh Labour's been probably harder on issues of constitution and identity than just being a soft nationalist party. So I think, it's very different, clearly. It hasn't had to go head to head with Plaid Cymru in the same way that Scottish Labour has had to do with the SNP. Indeed, the conversations that are ongoing between Welsh Labour and Plaid Cymru now tell you something about shared ideological ground, particularly around constitutional matters. And I think that's a really significant factor. Leadership comes into play too. I think Mark Drakeford's identity as Welsh-speaking West Walian, again, neutered some of the territory that Plaid Cymru would have been happier moving into. And of course, that space has been squeezed out by Mark's predecessors as well, in the form of Rhodri Morgan and Carwyn Jones. The other academic point to make, I guess, if we're looking at voting patterns in the election and how this has some resonance on the debate that we're having, is that originally in the 1999 elections, Leighton talked a bit about this, Plaid Cymru did extremely well in persuading people who would normally vote Labour at UK elections to vote Plaid at Senedd elections or Assembly elections, as was. It did that best in 1999, but it's done it pretty much, Plaid has done that pretty much throughout the history of devolution with different degrees of success. I think what we can say about the 2021 election was that Labour staunched that flow. So it was capturing ground from people who would normally have voted Plaid in a Senedd election and Labour in a UK election. And I think a lot of that comes down to identity and the kind of language that was being used by Mark Drakeford and Welsh Labour during that campaign. And finally, John, if I may, just a word on independence, because as Mick alluded to, I'm co-chairing a commission that Mick has established, which will look at all options for Wales's constitutional future. And I have to say, I think that shows a degree of bravery from a party in government, a party that, I don't know if it's fair to call Labour a unionist party, but a party that is at least technically committed to reforming the union of the nations of the UK, however that looks in the future. So I think it's a brave move to set up a commission that has a remit to look at every potential option. But bear in mind where Labour is amongst people who support independence at the moment. And this is significantly different to Scotland. The research that we've got shows that Labour in the last election gained between 40 and 50% of independence supporters. So Plaid, in a sense, couldn't muscle in even on its single constitutional aim of independence, because more people who supported independence voted for Labour than they did for Plaid on its own, split in other parties as well. So different to Scotland, where the SNP owns the issue of independence. Here, the question of support for independence can actually take place within the context of Welsh Labour and within the context of Plaid Cymru. That's significant, I think, for the future, particularly. And the final point I'll make about independence is that, you know, clearly far more people oppose independence in Wales and support it. But the interesting bit about independence is always those people who are what we've all called indie curious, the people who want to have conversations about independence. They're not necessarily people who would still convert to being independent supporters, but the fact those conversations are happening within and out with the political parties is a significant one. And at the moment, it looks like Labour's progressive patriotism, or however you want to term it in its identity, is allowing it to move in safely into that territory as well. And I think that will be significant electorally as well as constitutionally in the future.
Thank you very much indeed, Laura. And that again was excellent. And that the picture that you're presenting there, which if I've got this wrong, people can challenge me on when I come to the answers, but essentially they're not being the same no-go areas for the Labour vote, either amongst the sort of British and English or the independent supporters, that there are perhaps in Scotland with the no-go areas amongst those people who wholly reject the union, or there seem to be at the moment for Labour in England amongst many people who emphasise their English identity rather than others. So I hope we can continue to explore that theme. I'm going to take some questions now from, just to remind people, from the Q&A function. If I can, I'll pick up ones from the chat too, but I'll take them to Q&A. And I'm going to bundle some of these together in themes, which is, I think, the best way of doing it. And I want to start really with this question about Brexit, which has been touched on, and what has happened here. Ian Lucas asks, why did Wales vote for it, and how should Welsh Labour now approach the issue of Brexit? Joe Lindsay says that, you know, it seems that in Wales, Labour managed to hang on to or win back people who voted Brexit, whereas in the Get Brexit Done election of 2019, that was almost the polarising issue in the English election of 2019. And Hugh Jones asks a more general question about, is there a contradiction between Wales' apparent progressive politics and the support there was in the Welsh election for Brexit? But can we have a look at this Brexit? What do we draw from Brexit? Both Wales voting for it and then Labour apparently winning those voters back. And what does that say that Welsh Labour should be saying about Brexit in the future? Leighton.
Okay, I want to link the Brexit question, I think, to a couple of points that Mick made in his contribution just now, where he talked about globalization and indeed deindustrialization, because the experience of a lot of people in Wales had been that globalization didn't work for them. You know, I think about the Burberry workers in my former constituency of the Rhondda, who saw their factory close in 2007, with a lot of the work being offshored, particularly to China. And the campaign that was run by the trades unions, in which we were very much involved there, was very much about the notion of keeping Burberry British. And I think I was never in any particular doubt that Wales was probably going to vote for Brexit back in 2016, just on the experience and the comments I was getting on the doorstep. I'd never before heard the word sovereignty come up on the doorstep as it did in that period as we were campaigning in 2016 for the assembly elections. But I do think that deindustrialization was one of the key factors that had an impact. Many of the factors why Wales voted Brexit were the same as why people voted Brexit in England. In terms of where people go now, you know, I may be one of the last people to ask this. I was a fervent second referendumer, and I was on every People's Vote march that there was. But I thought that though it's not my position, the phrase that Keir Starmer came out with a few weeks ago, that it was no longer about getting Brexit done, it was about making Brexit work, is probably, given that this issue is now, I suspect, sadly, resolved for a generation, the UK has left the European Union. I thought that phrase, making Brexit work, gave quite a lot of opportunities for Welsh Labour and UK Labour, in fact, in the sense of identifying what that might mean, closer working with European partners rather than always in their face, all of those things, it seems to me, matter. And final thing I want to say, because it bears on a question that I saw in the Q&A from Peter Hain, I think one of the messages that we ought to be thinking about is deindustrialization is not patriotic. When in a pandemic, you have to ship in PPE from overseas, when in and Mick can talk about what the Welsh Labour government has done, in fact, in respect to some of this. When in when post-pandemic, you find you can't get glass vials for blood tests, then that starts to open up, it seems to me, a whole new conversation about deindustrialization, about strategic industries, and about what is patriotic.
Thank you very much. I'll go to you next, Mick, and perhaps you or Laura could shed some light on the apparent success of winning back Brexit voters. It almost feels in England as though once somebody had voted Brexit, they weren't likely to vote Labour again. That doesn't seem to be in your experience. It'd be interesting to know if I'm right about that. And was there a particular appeal to those voters, or was it the things we've already been talking about that appeared to work? Mick?
Well, I think you have to start from the point, which is where I think Leighton was going, is that one of the real underlying factors in the Brexit vote was disempowerment and inequality. I think those things emanate, and we see this all around the world. And in terms of the election and Brexit, I mean, it's very clear a lot of people that voted Brexit came back to Labour. They might have been traditional Labour voters in the past. Why did they do that? I think they did that, one, because the language from Welsh Labour began to focus again on policies and services that relate to their lives, which are important. And that was accompanied by, I think, a reputation for competence that had emerged out of COVID. I mean, I'd walk down the street with Mark Drakeford, and it was like being with a film star, people coming up to take photographs. Yes, people knew him, but the number of people, particularly over 50s, who came out to say, thank you for what you've done. So that combination of that confidence, I think, was really significant. Now, what has also happened, though, is that, well, now that you sort of moved away from the sort of core battle over Brexit, what you're coming back to is, of course, is now a struggle with the UK government, which is a centralising government, which believes, in fact, taking back control meant taking back control to London, to Westminster. So there are two areas, I think, where, to some extent, the narrative that was built begins to work the other way. So I was able to say in the Senate the other week that, to some extent, what we're doing in terms of constitutional reform is looking at taking back control. And how can it be possible for people who supported Brexit not to actually go down that line and saying, well, why shouldn't Wales have more control? And then it also leads you to the other thing of levelling up, which is levelling up the constitution. That what Brexit has resulted in a increased dysfunction in the relationship in terms of standards. The umbrella of the EU is gone. And that means that you've actually got to reappraise the relationship between the nations. And I think that is something that is also emerging. And I think that also began to tie in a little bit with the respect for the fact of Welsh Labour, that the Welsh Labour identity came across very strongly. The moment you took the Welsh off it, it began to be seen to be differently. So I just think the dynamic of politics, the dialectics of politics has changed and it has shifted. Laura is absolutely right, though. There's no easy ride ahead for Labour. The politics and the cohesiveness is as fragile as it ever was. I suppose the difference between Wales and Scotland is that Welsh Labour is embracing that change on the basis of values and so on. And that is, I think that is a very, very distinctive difference as well.
Thank you very much. And I like the suggestion of subverting the language in the way that you're talking about there. Laura, Brexit voters.
Yes, just a couple of points from me. I mean, I was going to start with the language point. I mean, I think the best compliment you can pay to your opponents is obviously to try and use the language that was successful for a more progressive cause. And I say that with some hesitation because I think we've got to be careful about assuming that Brexit isn't part of a progressive agenda. Many of us here feel it isn't, but for some voters and some voters on the left, there is another argument that Brexit can be entwined with a progressive agenda. So let's be careful not to play out the same kind of failure of the Yes campaign back in 2016 by assuming that we, are always speaking the language of people around us. I think that's very, very important. But I think the taking back control, Leighton mentioned sovereignty and governance. I think translating really fundamental issues of sovereignty and governance into understandable and meaningful language, like getting more autonomy, assuming that we can control our own affairs, will actually play out very differently now in the constitutional debate that we're about to have in Wales. I think some people in the question and answers were asking, why did Wales vote Brexit if progressive politics and Labour voting is so normalised? Well, I think there's a whole host of reasons for that, which I won't go into. But let's remind ourselves that we've always had a very tightly constrained Welsh public sphere and hugely limited by a pretty immature media. But more generally, there's been very, very few opportunities to have distinctive debates in Wales that involve more than a tiny proportion of the population. And unfortunately, Brexit played that out writ large. I think just a point about elections and kind of a word of warning. We know that in many respects, Welsh voters are not as polarised purely by yes and no in Brexit referendums as they might be in other parts of the UK. And we also know that the Welsh identity factor featured as much amongst no voters as it did amongst yes voters. So, when you mix all that up into the kind of marble cake of identities, you can see why it wasn't ever going to be impossible for Welsh Labour to capture that vote back. But remember, it is completely contingent on electoral context too, because Labour did lose voters who were Brexit supporters in the 2019 and 2017 general elections. They didn't lose them, and in fact, they captured them back in 2021 Senedd election, but that wasn't a Brexit election. We know that in terms of salience, Brexit featured much, much more low in the list of priorities. So context plays fundamentally in that as well.
Thank you. And I think that's an important point. It's often forgotten because the Labour Party has its own rows about the Corbyn legacy, but that in 2017, Jeremy Corbyn did much, much better amongst English identifying voters in an election where Brexit was apparently not on the agenda than he did in 2019, where it became the central issue. So that question of context is obviously important outside of Wales as well. Could we just pursue a bit longer the question of deindustrialisation, which Leighton has already raised? But there are two questions, one from my old friend and colleague Peter Hain and another one from Geraint Powell, really suggesting that asking about the effect of deindustrialisation and particularly on politics outside the big cities, and whether actually there's something of an English trend for Labour's strength to be in the big cities, and whether Labour's patriotic agenda is going to be sufficient to hold power in the future in those deindustrialised and smaller communities where clearly Labour has done badly in England. Mick, do you have a view about the strategy for those areas? And is this right, as Geraint says, that there's a big city phenomenon developing in Wales?
Well, I think the difficulty with the question is we don't really have a big city society within Wales. Most people in Wales don't live in big cities. We really have, I suppose, four major cities and a number of smaller towns. So the majority of the working class communities within Wales, I mean, if you look at the big block of Labour seats, that red block of small compact seats, which delivers so many Labour seats, None of them are in the big cities. I mean, it is an irony, of course, that Welsh Labour has done very well within the big cities as well, actually, winning most of the seats amongst what are even more sort of perhaps a slightly more prosperous and more middle class communities. I think the point about the outside the cities for Labour in Wales is, of course, that you have a declining community of people who had that experience of living through the industrialized, the former miners, the former steel workers, factory workers, manufacturers, and so on. And you have a new generation of people that are coming through who've never seen a lump of coal, etc. And I think the key is the actual raison d'etre for what Labour stands for. It's the values. So the things I see beginning to come through increasingly are things like the environment. They are the focus on public services and on the delivery. They are on health. And of course, Welsh Labour is in quite a strong position there, not because there aren't major challenges on health. There are across the UK and the world, but in terms of the nature of the population, the age of the population, but the fact also that we haven't developed the internal market and all that sort of stuff within health. So we have different narratives around those. But I think for the big cities, for Labour, I think in England, I think the issue is very different to the one that it is within Wales.
Thank you. Anything to add to that, Laura?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think it's back to my point that where Welsh Labour is different is that it straddles many different demographics in terms of its appeal in Wales, which it doesn't in England at the moment, and it certainly doesn't in Scotland. So it can capture the Leave, Remain voters. It can capture people in urban areas, and there's some potential for growth, by the way, outside urban areas as well. That's different not only to its opponents in Wales, but it's probably different to Labour in England, and I think that's quite significant.
Yeah. Leighton, do you have anything? You touched on this earlier. Anything to add, or shall I move on to another?
Two quick points, I think. First, I'm glad Mick made the point that by and large people in Wales don't live in big cities. And the valley constituencies are easily misunderstood, it seems to me. Some of the most beautiful landscape in the country, some of the same problems that many rural areas have, closure of facilities, particularly after austerity, for example. And I think also there's a strong sense of loss very often, which is related to that whole issue of not only of community facilities that have been shut because of austerity, but also to deindustrialization, and a strong sense that those communities that have built the industrial base of the UK have not been treated fairly. And that comes out, I think, in a strong sense of a desire for a fairer society that Welsh Labour has been able to build on.
Yeah. Could I ask on that, though, why has Labour not suffered from the incumbency factor in those communities? And it may be down to the policies of the Assembly and the Senate, but looking at many of the reports that have been produced on the red wall seats in England, one factor in the Conservative insurgency has been the fact that people have been voting for a Labour council for the last 100 years, and these things have apparently disappeared under Labour. Welsh Labour doesn't seem to have suffered, though it may have had setbacks in 2019 and 2017 in the general election, doesn't seem to have suffered from the blame of incumbency in electoral politics in the way that's happened elsewhere, and also happened in Scotland. Is there a reason for managing to overcome the blame for these changes and actually putting the blame probably where they more fairly lie with deindustrialisation and globalisation? Leighton.
Well, I mean, I think there have been setbacks. I mean, I think that, I lost my seat to the leader of Plaid Cymru in 2016, and part of the reason for that was a reaction to education reorganisation in the borough by the Labour Council. So, I don't think Welsh Labour has been able to cut itself adrift from that. There have been a number of examples in elections where Labour local authorities lost significant power, where Labour's lost significant power in local authorities across Wales, certainly in the early 2000s, for example. So Labour has had to readjust to that, it's had to renew, and it's had to learn the lessons of that. And I think it's had to learn those lessons from probably the first Assembly elections in 1999, which of course also coincided with local authority elections, which, for example, in Rhondda Cynon and Taff, resulted in Plaid Cymru winning that borough as well as winning the Rhondda constituency seat.
Okay.
John, can I? Oh, sorry.
Yes, Laura, then
sorry.
Mick.
Oh, sorry, Mick. Yeah, just to bounce off something that Leighton has quite rightly alluded to there, and take it a stage further. I think we've got to be careful about this idea that incumbency, hasn't bitten Labour. I mean, I think it came very close to doing so in the UK general elections, but Labour hung on in there in some of the so-called red wall seats in North East Wales, and lost some of them. So it was a kind of mixed bag. It didn't hit Welsh Labour as badly as it hit the Labour Party in England, admittedly. But I think the Senedd elections were altogether different because in some regards, incumbency became an asset then because of COVID and the fact that being the government in power and demonstrating competence and authority in the handling of COVID gave incumbency a positive slant, which obviously benefited Mark Drakeford and Welsh Labour. I think the other factor to bring into account is the opposition parties. I mean, there's a whole host of things you could say about Welsh Conservatives and Plaid Cymru, but I think the best thing to say about both of them is neither party has had a strategy for success, and neither party really has understood how to target its resources in the best way to win an election. And winning an election in Wales is complicated, of course, by our weird and wonderful electoral system, which is looking increasingly dysfunctional, by the way, as days progress. But of course, it's quite easy, or relatively easy, to get a majority of seats with 35 to 40% of the vote with the electoral system we have, despite it being a hybrid PR system. And the two opposition parties have been pretty appalling at working out how they might actually penetrate the Labour vote, because the only way they could ever become a large party and dominate a future government is by winning constituency seats off Welsh Labour. And quite frankly, I mean, Leighton's alluded to his defeat in Rhondda, but apart from that, really, you can count on, both hands really, how successful either of the opposition parties have been in winning constituency seats off Welsh Labour.
Okay, Mick. Thank you, Laura. Mick.
It's certainly the case that voting has become far more volatile across all parties and across all parts of Wales. The fact that Labour almost in the 2017 general election took the most Welsh-speaking constituency in the whole of Wales, by a margin of sort of several tens of votes, and I think that shows the diversity. The hardcore traditional industrial Labour voter that will vote Labour come what may, the red rosette or the donkey type narrative that's always given, that doesn't exist. Well, I don't think it ever existed, actually, but it doesn't exist now, not at the scale that it used to. And what you have is a larger portion of the population is what you might call the soft Labour vote, or sometimes the soft Plaid vote, where there is a lot of commonality, I think, of politics. And I think just as Welsh Labour has moved far more in terms of the national identity, language, and so on, equally so as Plaid Cymru moved far more trying to be more Labour than Labour. At times, particularly doing the New Labour. So that sort of crossover, you have one of those sort of circular Venn diagram things where they cross over. There is an enormous area of commonality, etc., which means that you have to vote and fight that much harder to actually, one, get people to vote, and that's a big issue in itself now. So getting people to actually turn out to vote, but actually then winning that vote. And I think that is where Welsh Labour has been most secure, because it has managed to, across the whole of Wales, in terms of language, in terms of identity, in terms of competence, in terms of economy, and in terms of tradition, has been able to pull those together into a identity, which I think the opposition parties haven't been able to do.
Thank you very much indeed. I want to ask you a question now, a couple of questions about resources and finance. One, I think I should put the question from Tom Jackson, who suggests that Welsh Labour's support is underpinned by a generous settlement from the Barnett formula. I suspect somebody will want to respond to the idea that Barnett's particularly generous for Wales. But Ian Lucas, another colleague, former colleague of mine, asks about the response now to an issue that's already been raised, which is the attempt of the UK government with its muscular unionism to reassert control or influence over things that have previously been devolved. For example, bringing the Shared Prosperity Fund and Levelling Up funding back into Whitehall to deal directly with Welsh localities. So firstly, where does Wales sit financially? And secondly, what is the political response to a much more assertive union government than we've seen previously? Mick, I'll come to you first on that, if I may.
Well, look, the starting point is that despite everything that's been said recently about how much money is being poured into Wales, by the end of the 3-year financial term, we will still be in real terms £3 billion worse off than we were in 2010. So austerity hasn't actually gone away. And that when the Levelling Up Fund, which has now become has become, as it was always intended to be, a political tool, that the promise that Wales wouldn't lose a penny is quite clearly recognised now to have been an untruth, let's put it that way. But what you have seen now is the politics of levelling up funding. The UK government is spending £120 million in Wales as part of the Levelling Up Fund. Isn't that wonderful? Of course, in actual fact, if we'd still been in the EU, we'd have probably had 375 million. So it is actually a £255 million cut. So we have the politics of sort of the way words and language are used that I think is going to become a bit of a battleground. But yes, you're right, Barnet. But I think the mistake when people talk about Barnet is that somehow it's this gift to Wales. It's the generosity of London and the English. Barnet benefits London, it benefits the northeast, the northwest, and it benefits Scotland. It was about always trying to create a certain amount of redistribution of wealth and equality around the whole of the UK. The fact is, it could operate much better. It could have a needs base, which would be a lot fairer. But it is one of the raison d'etre. It is one of the reasons for being part of the union, and that is that the issue of equality and redistribution of wealth is absolutely fundamental. But when it is presented as though that is the only reason why Wales should remain part of a union, then I think that is a fundamental weakness. There's got to be more to it than that. It isn't a reason, I think, why people vote for Welsh Labour. I don't think it's even a reason why people vote for a unionist party or otherwise. I think most people aren't actually really aware of how that funding works, but it is directly relevant because it enables services to be provided in poorer areas across the UK, but it is certainly not something that is a sort of gift to the Welsh. It is something that rises out of an entitlement to a relationship, and the more those commonalities are reduced in impact, the greater the likelihood and the fragmentation of the UK.
Okay. Leighton?
I don't really have a lot to add to what Mick's just said, but I mean, 2 quick points. One is, of course, that the Barnet formula has been found by research over many years to be particularly beneficial to Scotland, given the UK government's perennial concerns about Scotland. I suspect that they will not do anything to address that. But I do think it is important to acknowledge what is really happening at the moment, that there is a deliberate political strategy to undermine the devolved institutions, and not only through the Shared Prosperity Fund, the Levelling Up Fund, but also, of course, through the operation of the Internal Market Act and the way in which other funds, such as the City Regions Programme, are used to build new kinds of alliances that seek to, for the UK government, that seek to undermine the devolved administrations.
Thank you. Laura, any thoughts?
Yeah, just a couple of quick things. I mean, I think that's a very valid point about lumping Wales in with Scotland when we talk about Barnet. You know, I just give you HS2 as an example, you know, classed as an England and Wales project. London Olympics, you know, where clearly Wales's return has been pretty shocking. So let's, you know, there's got to be a greater awareness of the differences and the lack of use of a formula that's based on need that impacts directly on Wales compared to its impact in Scotland. And secondly, the point about muscular unionism. I mean, I think this is a really important one because, you know, is it Newton's law? You know, for every action there is an opposite reaction. And I think actually the kind of simplistic muscular unionism that the UK government is following, you know, the kind of brandishing Union Jack, and you know, we came close to having a gigantic Union Jack, didn't we, outside the main entrance to Cardiff Central Station. That kind of unionism seems to me to be completely anachronistic, and it's almost as if when you missed the boat, you still try to swim out to the boat, you know. And I think that's not really where things are in the debate about the union. I mean, we've had the First Minister in Wales talking about the fact that the union cannot survive in its current form and that reform is inevitable, and it's about shaping that reform. I think that's a much better starting point for a conversation about what relationships we want to be in place between the nations of the UK. And that actually takes in everything from devolution as it stands to independence, because even if Scotland were to be independent, or Wales, or both would be independent, there would still be a relationship between the nations on these islands. So, you know, that seems to me to be a much better one. And I think the kind of ideas that the UK government have about enforcing an understanding of the union are likely to be hugely counterproductive. They're likely to be ones that damage the union more than embed it in the public's consciousness. And depending on your position, whether you think that's a good or a bad thing, that I think is inevitable, because it's being conducted with, let's say, a less than granular understanding of how people think in Wales, never mind how they vote. And I think that will come back to bite certain people in difficult places.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move on now just to pick up a comment that was made by Mark Sanford actually in the chat. But he basically makes the point that to have the discussion that you, Mick, want to have about shared sovereignty, that means persuading people who are currently sitting in the Westminster Parliament, who believe it to be the sovereign parliament, that they should take part in that discussion. How on earth do you, and there's no sign from the Conservatives of doing that at the moment, and there's a Constitutional Commission, but there's nothing from the Labour Party at the moment suggesting that it is rethinking the sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament, which was at the core of the devolution settlement back in 1997, 1998. So how do you get people into the discussion that the Welsh Government and you say is necessary for the future of the Union? Mick.
Listen, that is really one of the very, very key questions. Why are we doing all this? Why are we having these conversations? Well, the starting point is whether UK government, Westminster, accepts it or doesn't. Sovereignty is already being shared because primary legislation is taking place out of their control in various areas. The reason why there is a dysfunction that risks, that threatens the fragility of the unity of the UK to some extent is because of a lack of recognition of that. The Westminster, to some extent, there is a burying your heads in the sand, etc. Now, how do we actually change that? Well, what is it we do to win the arguments, to convince? Well, the very fact that we are having this discussion today from an English university about Wales and what the impact of that is just one example of why it's important. The fact that Gordon Brown and the UK Labour Party, the Majesty's opposition, are have their own constitutional commission shows that there is a debate that has taken place. The fact that Labour can win, for example, seats in Manchester with 63% of the vote and do disastrously in other areas shows the way in which the politics, even with England, is changing. The view I take is this, is that governments change, politics is volatile, politics doesn't remain the same forever. If someone had asked me in 1979 that there would be another referendum in 20 years' time, that Labour would win, and that 20 years later it would have primary legislative powers and be a parliament, I would have probably laughed. I'd have said, you're dreaming, perhaps in 100 years or so. The reality is those things change, those processes are underway, and there is that political dynamic. dynamic. And I think what you have to do, what we are doing, I think within Wales, and I think what is beginning to happen in England as well, is that those dysfunctions are recognised and debates are developing. They are at different stages because of the difference in our constitutional structure. But I think within Wales, one of our things is to say, look, we can see this debate is happening. There is going to be change. We just don't want to be reactors to that change. We actually want to actually have our own say as to what we think that change should be and how that should develop. And I think that is the change in the nature of the debate that's taken place within Wales, but is as equally relevant to, I think, processes that are happening in England as well. Thank you.
Leighton, anything to add, sir?
Well, I'm a lot more pessimistic than Mick on this one. I've got to say, in his book on Scotland back in 2014, Gordon Brown talked about the notion of shared sovereignty, which he said was underpinned, if you like, by the Supreme Court, which was able to make key decisions ultimately, where there needed to be decisions between approaches taken in devolved parliaments and elsewhere. I'm pessimistic about it for a couple of reasons. One is the obvious one, that parliamentary sovereignty exists. You know, at the end of the day, Westminster could vote technically to abolish the Welsh Parliament or the Scottish Parliament. I'm not sure it's saying it's likely to, but it could technically. So parliamentary sovereignty does exist. The second thing I would say is that I think that that shared sovereignty that was underpinned by the Supreme Court is itself under threat because the Tories have made menacing noises about the role of the Supreme Court as a constitutional court. You know, that role may in future be under threat. And my final reason being pessimistic is that ultimately I think Labour is prone to what I call Westminsterism. At the end of the day, I think Labour as institutionally is committed to Westminster as the ultimate place of sovereignty, regardless what I might think, you might think, Gordon Brown might think. I think that's the reality of Labour culture on the whole.
Thank you. Laura, you've taken on this role. You presumably think it's worthwhile. So do you have a sense of where the debate will go across the UK?
Yeah, well, look, I certainly think it's worthwhile, but that's notwithstanding some understanding of everything Leighton has said there a moment ago. I mean, I gave evidence to the Lords Committee on, I can't remember its title, Future of the Union or the Recasting the Union recently when they were in the Senate. And of course, we talked exactly about that very point. You know, parliamentary sovereignty is a reality. We know the attacks on the infrastructure of the Supreme Court, and we know where that might leave us. But nevertheless, my response, I think, would be what can we do to at least prepare Wales for what might lie ahead? And it's back to Mick's point, really, about Wales, first of all, being proactive about our constitutional future and having the debate about at least the people's understanding of sovereignty. They may not even call it sovereignty. They may call it power, policy, control. But COVID, as we've said earlier, shown, I think, to not just the Welsh people, but the people of Manchester with Andy Burnham's actions, you know, people of even smaller units of local government, that their politicians are exerting power and authority and policy and discharging those in a way that they hope is best for them. So you can have this debate at one level, of course, academically, legally, elite framed, or you can also have the debate about how the people are starting to see politics. And I'm not sure where that will go, by the way. I mean, maybe post-pandemic, things will almost revert to type. But that's an important consideration. The other important consideration for our commission, when we really start working, is to be at least evaluative in an empirical way about what constitutional options will best suit Wales and are viable for Wales. And the truth of the matter is, we've never really had a mature conversation about that in Wales. If you look back to the period leading up to devolution, the debate was pretty immature. It was pretty sparse. It was pretty elite-led. And even in the case of the first referendum, where with a low turnout, the support was very marginally passed. If we go on to the 2011 referendum, again, you know, the vast majority of people didn't engage in an active way with that. So we're in a very different place now. This is an opportunity for Wales to at least be having serious, mature, sensible conversations about the Constitution. The biggest problem in all of this, as we all know, is forget UK government, is UK Labour. And I think Leighton sort of alluded to that right at the end. We could do the best work in the world in terms of mapping out a constitutional future for Wales, but the route to that happening is dependent on Keir Starmer and UK Labour, and that is quite fundamental, and quite frankly over to people in the Labour Party on that, because I'm not sure how you change that strategy.
Thank you. For what it is worth, my own evidence to the House of Lords Committee on the Future of the UK, which contains something that looks very like shared sovereignty, is the best way forward. So at least some people are learning, I think, from discussions that have taken place in Wales, and they do make sense to at least one person in England as well. I'm just going to ask one more question, if I may, because it's a good way of rounding this up. It comes from Andrew from the think tank Same Skies, and if the panel haven't heard of them, they're a West Yorkshire citizen-based think tank. He's essentially saying, look, actually, was this all really about decentralisation? Was it the institution of the Welsh Assembly, the Welsh Senate, that has enabled Labour to succeed? Because, as somebody's already said, Andy Burnham seems to be doing quite well in Manchester, and actually some of the Conservative mayors, like in the West Midlands, are also building support. So is this really actually a phenomenon of decentralisation that we're seeing in Wales? And can you, should that be what Labour's trying to go for, rather than engaging in what we've been this morning or this afternoon calling patriotic politics? Leighton, you started, and if you like, make this your final remarks too, but you started the question with the history. It was very clear that the institution was integral to what has happened in Wales. Is it just the institution, or is there more to it than that?
It's very clear to me, I think, that it's not just about decentralisation. The institution, the creation of the Assembly, initially very weak, now a very strong lawmaking parliament, has been important in the way that political thinking has developed, in the way that political discourse has been shaped, in the way that relations within political parties, such as the Labour Party, have been shaped. And I wouldn't want in any way to underestimate the importance of the conception that evolved under Rhodri Morgan of Welsh Labour. There are big questions to be asked about decentralisation within Wales, about the relationship of the Welsh central government, if you like, to local government and local communities that have not yet been properly addressed, I suspect, within Wales. But I do think the patriotic question has been very central to Labour's evolution in Wales over the last 20 years or so, and the role of the institution has developed within that discussion about a wider patriotism, if you like, a wider sense of what Welshness has been about. I think that that's the historical reality here. I think some of the issues are different within England. I think, at this stage, I think there is and you've been leading this, John, a really important debate about the nature of Labour in England, Labour's willingness to recognise England as a nation, to think about national structures within England. All of those, I think, are important questions as Labour comes to terms with a new union for the future. And that's very much, I hope, what we'll see come out of the work that Laura and Rowan Williams are doing and their commission for the Welsh Government.
Thank you. Laura, then I'll go finally to Mick.
Well, I won't say much. Leighton said pretty much everything I was going to say about the double devolution. I think that's something we've got to think more about. Actually, Wales has become a fairly centralised nation itself since devolution. And I think that's something that's got to change, in terms of devolving further down, decentralising further down. But I don't think you can just talk about this as decentralisation, because all of the evidence that we have and all of the research on elections particularly shows that it's the Welsh bit of Welsh Labour that has made it so successful, or at least given it the opportunity to be successful. I mean, clearly there's a pretty, whether the machine is as strong as it was is another question. But Welsh Labour has a successful electoral machine aligned with an identity that is Welsh that appeals to most of the demographics in Wales, or at least has an opportunity to appeal to most of the demographics in Wales. And that's what makes it stand out, I think, for me. And that then gives the platform for what we've been talking about, progressive patriotism. I'm not sure exactly what that means, by the way, but nonetheless, the fact that Labour has an opportunity to address that is a reflection of its Welshness as much as it is of its other values. And it certainly, whilst the Senedd has been critical in giving a platform for Labour to grow in that way, I don't think this can be boiled down purely to an institutional change like decentralisation. It's much deeper than that.
Thank you. And Mick?
Yeah, I mean, it is more than decentralisation. Decentralisation was the start of the process. But the moment you move beyond that, you're moving to actually the empowerment of people and communities. And so there are real issues. I think there are real issues in terms of Holyrood, in terms of Cardiff Bay, and in terms of Westminster, in terms of their role and their centralist roles and so on. The difference is, of course, I think that there is a strong opportunity, and I hope the Constitution Commission that Laura is involved in will look at this thing about it, the empowerment of people, because it seems to be quite fundamental. But what has changed very much within Wales from when I came to Wales, actually from England in 1973, is that Wales is now much more Welsh. It has a clearer identity, and it is not an identity that's dependent on language, whether you speak Welsh or whether you don't. The language has no longer become the divisive issue that it was when I first. In many ways, it is a unifying issue for people, whether they speak Welsh or whether they don't. The fact that my constituency, 30%, which was a very anglicised over several generations constituency, very few Welsh speakers, 30% of pupils now learn through the medium of Welsh. Most of their parents are non-Welsh speakers. So there is an identity and emancipation. And it is similar to processes, I think, that are taking place in the regions of England. It's just historically with Wales being almost treated as an appendage of Westminster, an appendage of England, and we saw that through the changes to the legal system, that has changed. There is a confidence of identity, and I think that is what's shaping the politics, and I think what has shaped actually the success of the Welsh Labour identity. But of course, as Leighton says, I think there are very, very serious challenges ahead in terms of the structure, role and identity of UK Labour. That's for another debate for another time.
Thank you very much indeed. And can I thank all of our panel. Apologies to a couple of people who asked questions, particularly a fascinating one about culture wars that I wasn't able to get onto. That'll have to be for another day. But I think that's been a very, very rich discussion. It's certainly left me with a strong sense, to pick up where we are at the end there, the intertwining of institutions, policy, culture, identity, and leadership all coming together to make to put Welsh Labour where it is today. If I could just end briefly on a couple of notices for those that are on the call. 30th of November, Tobias Phipps from the Common Good Foundation will be talking about a new manifesto for popular environmentalism and looking at England and people's relationship with the land, with nature and sustainability. And on the 15th of December, I'll be, if you like, coming to the front of the panel to do a paper with John Wilson from King's in London, looking at Labour's statecraft and how Labour should approach the governance of the union. So I think you'll find that some of the issues that we've talked about this afternoon will come up again at that event. But we will obviously advertise that to all the people who registered for this event. So again, thanks to the panel, thanks to those of you who've joined us. We'll put the video on the website as soon as we can, and look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thank you very much, everyone.